did Jesus rise from the dead? The question that I'd like to start off with is, first of all, when we talk about, we've just had this reading from 1 Corinthians 15, and Paul says in verse 1, I declare to you the gospel which I preached unto you, which also you received, and wherein ye stand. So first of all, what is the gospel? Okay, simple question. Well, Paul goes on in verses 3 and 4 to tell us what he means by the word gospel. There in verse 1, he says in verses 3 and 4, for I delivered unto you, first of all, that which I also received, how that Christ died for our sins, according to the scriptures, that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day, according to the scriptures. Okay, so the word gospel means good news. And what Paul is saying is that the good news is the fact, or the assertion at least, that Jesus rose from the dead. Okay, the resurrection of Jesus Christ is central to everything that the New Testament teaches about Jesus. It validates his teaching, it validates his life and his claim to be the Son of God. So if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, I mean, the point that I'm making here is that this subject is not a marginal subject. It is right at the heart of everything that we believe. Without the resurrection of Jesus, we've got no reason to be here. And if we still want to sort of believe something based on the Bible, then we could go and, join the synagogue or something. Without the resurrection of Jesus, there's no Christianity. It's as simple as that. That is the fundamental foundation on which everything rests, the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. So we are not talking about a marginal subject. We're talking about something that is right at the heart of what we believe. The gospel, the good news, Paul says, is the fact that Jesus died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the scriptures. And the reason why this is so important to Paul is because there are a number of things that follow on from this. First of all, in verse 17, if Christ be not raised, your faith is vain, you are yet in your sins. So Paul is talking in the negative, but in the positive, what Paul is saying is that because Jesus did rise from the dead, we can have a relationship with God through him. We can have a new living relationship with God. And we touched on this morning. We can have a different sort of relationship with God through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And then the other thing that flows from this is verse 20. We can look forward to being raised from the dead when Jesus returns. Jesus is the first fruits of them that slept. And then if we were to carry on reading 1 Corinthians 15, verse 25, talks about the establishment of God's kingdom when Jesus returns. And then the final enemy that will be destroyed is death itself, because sin is the real pandemic. Okay? So the idea of the resurrection of Jesus Christ is at the heart of everything we believe. It's the foundation. And without this historic claim, without it being true, our faith is empty. It doesn't amount to anything. Okay? So being able to prove this, or being able to believe it in a credible way, I think is really, really important for us. Okay? So the resurrection is important. But before we sort of come on to examine those other issues, what do we actually mean by resurrection? Let's first of all define what we actually mean by Jesus rising from the dead. Resurrection, what does that actually mean? Well, in the Gospel of Luke 24, we have Jesus, or Luke, including this incident to explain that when Jesus rose from the dead, Jesus himself was careful to make the point that he was not a spirit. Okay? Now, Luke, the narrator, isn't telling us this. Okay? It's actually Jesus who is reporting said these things. It is I myself, verse 39, handle me and see, for a spirit hath not flesh and bones as ye see me have. Okay? So Jesus is saying it's really me, it's the person you knew. And then to underline the point in verse 40, he asks for something to eat. The point is that resurrection is a distinctly physical thing. Okay, it is a physical thing. It's not it's not being a disembodied spirit or something like that. Okay, so the resurrection is central to everything the New Testament says, and it's just a physical thing. Okay, but can we corroborate the New Testament's claim that Jesus existed, that he was crucified, and that he rose from the dead? Can we actually demonstrate that? Well, it would be good to get a confirmation of at least the very existence of Jesus in some way, perhaps from a source outside the Bible. And actually, there is a source that corroborates Jesus's existence and the fact that he ran into trouble with the Jewish authorities. And it's from a source called the Babylonian Talmud. And the Babylonian Talmud was a collection of rabbinical discussions about Jewish law, biblical interpretation, ethics, customs, and history. And this is what the Babylonian Talmud says. It says, on the eve of the Passover, they hanged Yesu, Jesus, and an announcer went out in front of him for 40 days saying, he is going to be stoned because he practiced sorcery and enticed and led Israel astray. Anyone who knows anything in his favor, let him come and plead on his behalf. But not having found anything in his favor, they hanged him on the eve of the Sabbath. Okay, so this is interesting, isn't it? Okay, it's from the Babylonian Talmud. It's about circa AD 400, 500, okay? But this is not a Christian source. It's a Jewish source, and it is hostile to Jesus and to Christianity. But notice that actually, in a strange sort of way, it actually sort of corroborates some of the things that the Gospels themselves say, okay? So here are a number of bullet points, which I think are interesting from that quotation. First of all, the Babylonian Talmud seems to confirm that Jesus was a real person, that he was a real historic person, that the Jewish authorities were hostile to Jesus, that Jesus was put on trial for a capital offense, that Jesus was accused of sorcery, Jesus was accused of false teaching, and there is if we just go back to the quote itself, he was given an opportunity. Look at an announcer went out in front of him for 40 days saying he's going to be stoned because he practiced sorcery and enticed and led Israel. Anyone who knows anything in his favor, let him come and plead in his behalf. But not having found anything in his favor, they hanged him on the eve of the Sabbath. So there's an anxiety there about the fairness of the legal process that Jesus was subjected to. Okay? So the interesting thing here is that actually, in a funny sort of way, this actually sort of corroborates some of the points that we read in the gospel accounts about what happened to Jesus. Obviously, there's a profound difference of opinion, but nevertheless, these two things are running in parallel. So let's go to Matthew's gospel, Matthew chapter 26. And the night of Jesus's trial, okay? Matthew 26 and verse 57. And they that had laid hold on Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. But Peter followed him afar off onto the high priest's palace and went in and sat with the servants to see the end. Now the chief priests and the elders and all the council sought false witness against Jesus to put him to death. Okay, just look at verse 59. I've highlighted it. The chief priests, the elders, and all the council false witness against Jesus to put him to death. And found none. Yea, though many false witnesses came, yet they found none. But at last came two false witnesses and said, this fellow said, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and build it in 3 days. Okay, so what's the significance of that? Particularly in the light of the Babylonian Talmud? Well, the Babylonian Talmud and the Gospel of Matthew, to some degree, run parallel to each other. The Babylonian Talmud runs parallel with the New Testament claim about Jesus. But the big difference is that the Babylonian Talmud brings into question the apparently outrageous claim by the Gospels, apparently outrageous claim, that Jesus was deliberately denied justice by the Jewish authorities in a sham show trial. And this is what Matthew is presenting to us here. He's basically saying it was actually the chief priests, the elders, and the council that wanted to put Jesus. This was the show trial. This is what Matthew is saying. Okay, this process was not fair. Okay, now the question is, what's more credible? Is it the Babylonian Talmud, which says that Jesus was given an opportunity to clear his name? Or is what Matthew and the Gospel saying more credible? Okay, because what Matthew and the Gospels are saying, if you look at it really critically, there's an incredible, sort of dereliction of justice here. Why would the authorities do that? Why would they behave like this? And the difficulty with Matthew is further compounded by this passage from the Old Testament, Deuteronomy chapter 17. At the mouth of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses shall he that is worthy of death be put to death. But at the mouth of 1 witness he shall not be put to death. The hands of the witnesses shall be upon him to put him to death, and afterward the hands of all the people. So thou shalt put the evil away from among you. Okay, so the problem with Matthew is further compounded by this: Jewish legal principles. What Deuteronomy is telling us is that it was the job of the court to ensure the rights of the defendant were not violated. Okay, look at Deuteronomy chapter 17 and verse 6 carefully. At the mouth of 2 witnesses or 3 shall he that is worthy of death be put to death. Okay, it was the witnesses who were in effect the prosecution. The witnesses were the prosecution. The job of the court, and in particular the Jewish high priest, was to act as Jesus's defense and to cross-examine the witnesses to see whether they were telling the truth. That's the way it should have been. But according to Matthew, this is what happened. Jesus held his peace. And the high priest answered and said to him, I adjure thee by the living God, that thou tell us whether thou be the Son of God. And Jesus said to him, Thou hast said. In other words, yes, you've said it. Nevertheless, I say unto you, hereafter you shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Verse 65, Then the high priest rent his clothes, saying, He's spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses? Behold, now you have heard his blasphemy. According to Matthew, what we see in practice, instead of the court defending Jesus's rights, what we see is an astounding breach of legal protocol, with the high priest acting as the prosecutor by asking Jesus a leading question that he knew would incriminate Jesus. Okay, so all of that is sort of well and good, but why is it important? Let's bring this back to the main point. The question is whether the New Testament claims about Jesus are credible. That's the question here, okay? Is what the New Testament teaching telling us about Jesus and what happened to him, is that credible? Is the claim by the Babylonian Talmud that Jesus was legally given the opportunity to clear his name more credible than the New Testament's assertion that Jesus was put to death as an innocent man and that he wasn't given a fair trial? Which of these two views are actually more credible? Why would responsible authorities behave in the way that the New Testament is claiming? Now, this is a big issue, okay? And not one to be lightly just brushed under the carpet. It's a big question, okay? Why would responsible authorities behave in the way that the New Testament claims? For instance, have they ever, in our own experience, have the authorities ever behaved in this way? Okay? And if they haven't, then why haven't they behaved in a way that was completely transparent and fair? Think of extraordinary rendition and things like that, for instance, in our own experience. Why did they do that? Why might they have done this in the case of Jesus? Well, I think John chapter 11 gives us the answer. Verse 47, Then gathered the chief priests and the Pharisees a council and said, What do we? For this man does many miracles. If we let him thus alone, all men will believe on him, and the Romans shall come and take away both our place and nation. And one of them, named Caiaphas, being the high priest that same year, said unto them, You know nothing at all, nor consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation perish not. Yes, we've seen over the last 20 years the lengths that authorities will go to ensure national security. Okay? From the perspective of the Jewish authorities, trying to keep a lid on public order so that the Romans wouldn't step in and take direct control, Jesus represented a serious threat to national security. The moment we realize this, and the febrile atmosphere under which all of this was being played out, the story presented in the Gospels actually makes complete sense. So now we have to decide whether the rest of this could possibly be true. Okay, so let's carry on, okay, with this. Matthew chapter 26 and verse 47. And while he yet spake, lo, Judas, one of the 12, came, and with him a great multitude with swords and staves from the chief priests and the elders of the people. In that same hour said Jesus to the crowds, Are you come out as a thief with swords and staves to take me? I sat daily with you in the temple teaching, and you laid no hand on me. But all this was done, that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all the disciples forsook him and fled. And they that had laid hold on Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. Okay, so according to Matthew's gospel, Jesus was arrested by night under the cover of darkness, tried and then put to death, even though he was an innocent man. His band of disciples, verse 56, all fled, they all abandoned him. They're not the heroes in this story, and that shouldn't surprise us, because credibly, their worldview had been completely shattered. They were hoping that in the decisive moment that Jesus would reveal himself as the Messiah they'd all been waiting for. Is this what Judas Iscariot thought as well? And then in contrast to that, Matthew 27 and verse 55, and many women were there beholding afar off, which followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering unto him, among which was Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's children. We've got Joseph of Arimathea, and then in verse 16, and there was Mary Magdalene and the other Mary sitting over against the sepulchre. So in contrast to the disciples who abandoned Jesus, we have a group of courageous women, the mothers of the disciples and Mary Magdalene, who stayed with Jesus until the end. They actually saw the burial. Okay? And here's an interesting thing, Matthew 27 and verse 62. Now the next day that followed the day of the preparation, the chief priests and Pharisees came together unto Pilate, saying, Sir, we remember that deceiver said, while he was yet alive, after 3 days I will rise again. Command, therefore, that the sepulchre be made sure until the 3rd day, lest his disciples come by night and steal him away, and say unto the people, He is risen from the dead, so the last error shall be worse than the first. Pilate said to them, You have a watch, go your way, make it sure as you can. So they went and made the sepulchre sure, sealing the stone and setting a watch. In contrast, the Jewish authorities, ironically, were jittery about Jesus's claims about rising from the dead. Even if the disciples had had their worldview shattered, the authorities were not going to take any chances, setting a guard and sealing the tomb. Okay, so now we come to the central question. Did Jesus overcome death by rising again? Okay, this is the heart of the issue now, isn't it? Okay, we've looked at some of the issues around this, about whether what the gospel story is a credible one. Okay, so, but did Jesus rise from the dead? And if he didn't, what actually happened? Over the years, there have been many alternative theories as to the resurrection. And here is a list of them, I think, of the the ones that we're familiar with probably. So if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, maybe the disciples went to the wrong tomb. Maybe the Roman or the Jewish authorities removed the body. Maybe Joseph of Arimathea removed the body. Maybe Jesus revived in the tomb and somehow managed to, make his way out past the sealed tomb and past the guards. Another possibility is that the disciples themselves stole the body. And then I'd like to suggest that there is actually one final possibility, which we'll come to right at the end of the talk. Okay? So there are several alternatives as to what might have happened to the body of Jesus. But I'd like you to have a look at Matthew 28 and verse 11. Now, when they were going, behold, some of the watch came into the city and showed the chief priests all the things that were done. This is after the resurrection, okay? This is after the claim for the resurrection. And when they were assembled with the elders and had taken counsel, they gave them a large amount of money to the soldiers, saying, say this, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we slept. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we'll persuade him and secure you. So they took the money and did as they were taught. And this saying is commonly reported among the Jews until this day. Okay, what happened to the body of Jesus? If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, what's the alternative? This question has been debated over the last 2,000 years. As we've seen, there have been several alternative theories to the resurrection claim. But the only credible one that was accepted at the time was that the disciples stole the body. All the other alternatives were dismissed by the smartest people in Jerusalem. Okay? The only one that was seen as being credible was the disciples stole the body. All the other alternatives were dismissed at the time. This was the one that these guys, people like Caiaphas, the Sanhedrin, these really, really smart people, this is the one that they went with, that the disciples stole the body. The question is that counterclaim credible? Is that counterclaim credible? And why would the authorities hand over cash if the disciples did steal the body? The idea of one rising from the dead is palpably ridiculous. So why would you have to bribe the guards to say it didn't happen? Unless, of course, it did. There's a question there. I mean, that's not conclusive. But here's an interesting thing. Mark chapter 16, after the resurrection, when Jesus was risen early on the first day of the week, he appeared to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he cast 7 devils, and she went and told them that had been with him as they mourned and wept. And they, when they heard that he was alive and had been seen of her, said, that's fantastic. That's great. He's been raised from the dead. Well, of course, they believed not. That's what it says, doesn't it? They didn't believe. After that, he appeared in another form onto 2 of them as they walked and went into the country. And they went and told it onto the residue. Neither believed they them. Verse 14, afterward he appeared unto the 11 as they sat at meat, and upbraided them with their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they believed not them which had seen him after he was risen. The irony was that Jesus's disciples were the ones who found it hard to believe that Jesus had been raised from the dead. But again, that's not conclusive, is it? That doesn't really prove anything. It might just prove that, the gospel writers were good storytellers. Okay? So there was one final alternative that we didn't explore on the end of my list. I said there was another alternative. And this is the one I think that we have here in John chapter 20. And remember that the Gospels are like strata, okay? The Gospels were written at different points in the early church's history. And John's Gospel was probably the last of the Gospels, okay? Written before AD 70. But look at what John 20 says, verse 24. But Thomas, one of the 12 called Didymus, was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples therefore said to him, we've seen the Lord. But he said unto them, except I shall see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe. After 8 days, again, his disciples were within, Thomas with them. Then came Jesus, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst, and said, Peace be unto you. Then said he to Thomas, Reach hither thy finger, and behold my hands. Reach hither thy hand, and thrust it into my side. Be not faithless, but believing. Okay, so it's curious that John's gospel, which is written sometime after the other gospel, includes this particular incident. Because there was one alternative to the resurrection that the authorities overlooked at the time. And this little detail gives, actually, strangely, a ring of truth to the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. Thomas Didymus, or doubting Thomas, has become a byword for skepticism. But this detail recalled in John's gospel, written later than the other gospel accounts of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, betrays an interesting detail. Why did Thomas doubt? Modern translations, of course, make this a lot easier to understand, because Didymus means twin. Thomas's skepticism is well founded because Thomas was a twin. We had a couple of lads in our CYC called Dwayne and Blaine who were identical twins. And I remember them playing five-a-side football with us. And they happened to be on my side. Well, I thought one of them was on my side, but actually it turned out they were both on my side. Because when the one was tired, he swapped with his brother. And we completely destroyed the opposition. But you couldn't tell them apart. They were absolutely identical. Thomas's skepticism is well founded because he was a twin and he knew how easy it was to trick people. When the earlier Gospels were written, their writers did not think to include this detail because it added nothing to their accounts of the resurrection. Yes, they knew that Thomas was a twin and why he doubted, but at the time, no one was seriously arguing that Jesus had an identical twin. Okay? By the time that John's Gospel was written, the evidence for the resurrection was so overwhelming that the only alternative now was to argue that Jesus had an identical twin. Thomas doesn't just want to look at Jesus, he wants to put his fingers into the marks in his body. He wants to make sure. He's not doubting Thomas, he's testing Thomas. It's a curious incident, and the significance of this is not always apparent to us. Okay, final passage, 1 Corinthians 15, going back to where we began. For I delivered unto you first of all that which I also received, how that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried and that he rose again the third day according to the scriptures. That's the good news, that Jesus rose from the dead, that he was seen of Cephas, then of the 12. After that, he was seen of above 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain onto this present, but some have fallen asleep. After that, he was seen of James, then of all the apostles. And last of all, Paul says, he was seen of me also, as of one born out of due time. How many people saw the risen Christ? Well, according to Paul, it was over 500. For those disciples who originally forsook Jesus and fled, the resurrection event changed their lives. They were never the same again. Many of them would go on and give their lives to what they witnessed. And of course, it changed Paul's life as well. He wasn't one of the 12, not one of his band of disciples from rural Galilee. Sorry about that. I was about to say Rory Gallagher, I think that blues guitarist. But Paul was actually a Hellenized Jew and a staunch opponent of this Jewish sect. But something profound happened to Paul that completely turned his life around. And it can change ours too. God's view of our problems is different to ours. The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ demonstrates this. And if you haven't really thought about this, you need to find out more about it, because it is the start of a journey as it was for them. Jesus is good news. Jesus is the best news, and Jesus is the biggest news. So I hope that this presentation has been helpful. This was done as a talk for an online podcast. Subscribe to the channel and look out for more presentations on the real gospel. You don't have to click on the details below. Thank you for listening.